This is Daniel Simon from Baton Rouge Community College. This is my week 3 podcast, uh, still on the 19th century, discussing the rise of nationalism, especially the unification of Italy and Germany. I will kind of talk for a little while on the outbreak of World War One, which comes on the heels of like German unification and all that. Now, at the time in Europe in the 1800s, the rise of nationalism continued um, in Europe overall, and a lot of political leaders, especially by the late 19th century, started to practice a new form of politics that was called realpolitik. And realpolitik was a term which means real politics. It's a kind of a German term going by by the Germans, and it had to do with the fact that in the past, a lot of diplomacy like that dealt with like international politics or domestic stuff dealt mostly with old theories that were more geared towards like morals, ethics, even maybe religion. But this form of new politics dealt more with pragmatic ideas, what was important for the state. And so it was more like political realism, they called it, or pragmatic politics. And so that's more what they were more worried about. That made nationalism, more successful, more popular. That's something you start to see by the mid to late 1800s, like especially like 1860s roughly. Um, so nationalism grew, more popular. The whole Metternich system we talked about before, that would decline, kind of implode. And like in Europe, you start to see like Napoleon III with the Second French Empire trying to revitalize the old glories of, the first empire that Napoleon I had formed before. Austria, tries to kind of keep its empire together. They formed the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was something that happens. Germany would unify, of course, into the German Empire. All the different German states will unify together, minus Austria. Italy will also unify too. So you have the Italian Unification, which starts pretty much in the late 1850s. So all these things kind of happen real fast in the mid to late 1800s. Let's first talk about Italian unification, which is one of the things we need to talk about today. Italian unification was something, like I told you, that had been popular before. Remember, because as you know, Napoleon had created the Kingdom of Italy originally back when he was emperor. Then after that, Mazzini, remember him, tried to form that Risorgimento movement. He had that Young Italy organization that wanted to unify Italy as a kind of a republican state, which didn't really go off well, and Mazzini was exiled. So that was all kind of going on. Italy itself was mostly occupied by foreign powers. Like most of northern Italy was occupied by Austria. Austria controlled a good bit of areas like Lombardy, Venetia, mostly northern Italy, northeastern Italy. It's pretty much controlled by them. And then southern Italy was controlled by this kingdom that was called the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. It was actually a Bourbon state. And I think that was kind of influenced by the Spanish. It was ruled by this king named King Francis II. And it was kind of a weak state, but they were in control of like Naples and also Sicily, which would be like southern Italy and basically what is Sicily. So they had all these areas that were pretty much, and of course the Catholic Church controlled like the kind of the middle, like the Papal States was still controlled by them, and Rome was kind of independent, so wasn't really part of a major state. There was one state that was independent. It was called the Kingdom of Sardinia, which existed up in the northwestern part of Italy, included like the area like around where Piedmont is. Also, it had an area they controlled, which was Savoy, and also Nice, which is now part of France. And then they also had the island of Sardinia, which is kind of west of Italy, next to what is Corsica. So that was the whole area that they mostly controlled. The state was called different names. Usually Kingdom of Sardinia, but some people did call it the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia with a dash in it or hyphen. What happened was it had a king that ruled it. He was pretty liberal. King Victor Emmanuel II ruled from 1820 to 78. And eventually he appointed some of the first prime ministers that reigned over it. They kind of eventually adopted kind of a constitutional monarchy. And one of the first important ones is a guy named Camillo Benso, who came to power in 1852. Of course, people don't call him that anymore. If you know about it, he's known as the Count of Cavour, and so people later called him Cavour for short. And Cavour was one of the main guys instrumental in getting Italy unified, because the Kingdom of Sardinia is the state that really leads to that. However, Austria was kind of in the way, from them getting any kind of unification of Italy. So Cavour realized this. He realized that the only way they were going to really do this is if they were able to get some kind of foreign power to come in and help, basically, Sardinia unify Italy itself. So what happened was in 1858, if you know about it, Cavour had this secret meeting with Emperor Napoleon III of France, the Second French Empire. They came to an agreement, which happened in July of 1858, July 21st, 1858, called the Plomb-Bletis Agreement. They met in Plomb-Bletis, France. And so it was called the Plomb-Bletis Agreement. In the agreement, the French said that they would help, Sardinia unify part of northern Italy if they would exchange, give land over to France. France wanted control of Savoy and Nice, which they gave them. We'll talk about Garibaldi. Wasn't too happy about the Nice one, I know, because he's from there. But anyway, so that happened, and so within a few months later, Sardinia declared war on Austria, which had different names. They called the war Austrian Italian War, or Italian War of 1859 broke out in April of 1859. It lasted several months until about July of 1859, and the French forces came in. They intervened on the side of Sardinia. They were able to drive the Austrian forces out of northern Italy. So eventually, what happened later was that the Sardinians will use this to try and take over what is Lombardy, which is in the north, also Venetia later, and they'll combine that into like one state eventually in the north, which I don't know if they ever had an official name of it. I think it's called the Kingdom of Sardinia. Some people call it the Kingdom of Upper Italy, but I don't think that was ever an official name. But they would unify the whole north, and then Sardinia would also invade down south and seize like where the Papal States is and take Rome. They'll eventually take over Rome later. So that will happen until 1860, though. Then Cavour hired a bunch of mercenaries. He had this guy named Giuseppe Garibaldi. He hired him as a mercenary to invade the southern part of Italy, Sicily and Naples, to seize that area, to add that to Italy as well as one state. Garibaldi is a famous mercenary in general. He's fought all over the place. He fought in Italy. I think he fought Austria in the 7 Weeks' War. He even went over to, I think, South America and fought over there, some of their wars. I think Abraham Lincoln was interested in hiring him during the American Civil War, but he turned him down. So he was a very popular general, considered a military genius, Garibaldi. Garibaldi had a nickname. You can see he had wore these red shirts in battle, and a lot of his men wore red shirts. And so he was called the Red One. And a lot of his troops are called red shirts because they wore red shirts with probably gray trousers. And so he hired about like 1,000-something men, and it became known as the Expedition of 1,000, or of the 1,000. And they would actually land their forces in 1860, like May of 1860, on Sicily originally. And they would seize Sicily first and take Sicily. And then from there, they marched up into what is Naples and took over Naples. And by 1860-61, I think it is, Naples fell to Garibaldi's forces. Eventually, Garibaldi met with, I think, Victor Emmanuel II. I guess around Rome, whatever, and basically combined the state. And eventually, by I think it's March 1861. They formed, of course, the Kingdom of Italy is created officially. And of course, Garibaldi didn't really want a kingdom; he wanted a republic. He was a pro-republican Italian nationalist. He was kind of miffed about Nice, because Nice was now in French hands. That was Garibaldi's birthplace, Nice. I think he later left Italy and went to South America and fought there later. But it would take a while, but Rome eventually, of course, became the capital of Italy, and officially it won't become the capital until 1871. By that time, Cavour's dead, but anyway, that's how Italy unified. Now, Italy struggled in the years after unification, like between that there and World War One. A lot of the problems in Italy was that there was a lot of big differences between northern Italy and southern Italy. If you know about southern Italy, it was very agrarian and not as industrialized, and the northern Italy was more industrialized, and pretty much Sardinia, which that was part of Italy, pretty much had a lot of the control over everything, like the northern areas, because I think it was Turin or Torino had been the original capital of the Kingdom of Sardinia. Now it's Rome. But they would struggle for years, and so Italy went through a lot of problems with their economy. There was a lot of strikes in the country by some workers, and so a lot of Italians left Italy. If you know about in the late 19th century, early 20th century, something like 5 million Italians eventually left. I guess all Sicilians too. And about 4 million migrated to the United States, and actually 1 million migrated to Argentina, believe it or not. So it wouldn't be really till World War One that Italy becomes more famous. Italy will, become more of a world power by then. And then Mussolini tries to make them even more powerful, but that kind of doesn't work out. But Italy is a kingdom from 1871 to 1946. Now it's a republic. So that was Italy, the unification, and all that. Let me next talk about which is German unification, which happened also in the mid to late 19th century. Now, Germany unified out of the German Confederation, which we had talked about before in previous podcast lectures, and remember correctly, the German Confederation had two main states that dominated it, which was Prussia and Austria. Of course, everybody thought that Austria was going to be the state, that would create the German unified state that we'd have later. But that didn't come to fruition because Prussia became the big power, as you know. And this all mostly happened under what is King Wilhelm the First, or King William the First, who was the ruler of Prussia from 1861 to 1688. He's later also the first Kaiser, well, three Kaisers that ruled over later the German Empire. He's also the first emperor, as they call it. That's the term they use, Kaisers, first emperor. And anyway, you had a chancellor under him that's real famous. Of course, everybody's heard of. I think we've probably talked about him before, which is Otto von Bismarck, which everybody calls now the Iron Chancellor. There he is in military uniform, and like those spike helmets that the Germans used up those up to World War One. But anyway, he was instrumental in really getting Germany unified. So he was the guy that was the guy behind it, statecraft behind it. He really practiced realpolitik. So he believed that unification was something that was politics of reality that could happen. And why was he called the Iron Chancellor? It had to do with different reasons, but one was a speech he gave when he first came to power in 1852. I can read it for you, but he said famously that the great questions of our day cannot be solved by speeches and majority votes. That was the great mistake of 1848 and 49, but by blood and iron. So he's saying that the only way they're going to really unify Germany is through force, war. They get all the German states to, unify, and then, of course, a lot of it was going to have to be done through war, which it did, and so that'll be also challenging other states that are around them that might want to stop them, like Austria and also France as well. So he's going to do this through various wars, and that's how Germany ends up, getting unified over time. And so there's two examples of this that really lead to German unification. One was a war that was fought. It was a very quick war, but also a very decisive war that was fought in 1866, which is the so-called 7 Weeks' War. It's also called the Austrian-Prussian War. It happened between June and July of 1866. It only lasted 7 weeks. Why did it last 7 weeks? Because the Prussian military just pummeled the Austrian armies. Why was that? Well, Prussia had, I think, somewhat industrialized, a little faster than Austria had, and by that time their militaries were just better. And they also had some really good military minds, like Helmuth von Moltke. If you ever heard of him, known as Moltke the Elder, was really one of their greatest generals of the time. He played a role in this war, in the Franco-Prussian War, and he was a kind of a genius. So they were better at tactics than the Austrians were. Also, new types of military technology played kind of a role too at the time, because you start seeing new kinds of weapons introduced, like breech-loading rifles and breech-loading artillery and things like that, and that made a lot of the battles more successful overall. The key battle or decisive battle of the whole war happened on July 3rd, 1866. That was the Battle of Kniggrtz. That happened in what is now the Czech Republic today. That was a battle where the Austrian forces actually somewhat outnumbered the Prussian forces. I think the Austrians had about 240-some thousand troops. Prussia had about 220,000, roughly. However, what proved kind of the decisive aspect of the battle was the fact that it was an interesting battle. It was one of the first battles where you had two opposing armies that were using two different types of rifles. The Austrians were still using muzzle loaders, which were fed from the actual muzzle at the top. We had to basically, reload standing up, and you might be able to shoot three shots a minute. Well, the Prussian side had a new rifle that just been invented called the Dries needle gun, which was a type of breech-loading rifle where you could just load it in the breech, like they do most guns now. And you could stand up, you could be lying down, whatever you want to do to reload it. And you could fire 6 shots a minute. So imagine the difference between that. And so that just gave them a big advantage, the Prussian forces. They decimated the Austrian forces in that battle. I think the Austrians had 44,000 killed and wounded. The Prussians only had 9,000. So it was a total lopsided battle. So a lot of battles like that were kind of lopsided. And so basically, after the war ended, they had the Treaty of Prague, which ended the war. And what the Prussians were able to do afterwards, the Prussians then took control of Germany and basically kicked the Austrians out of the Confederation. They formed their own confederation, which was later called the North German Confederation, which formed in 1866. That became the prototype state, what will be the German state or German Empire that'll form later. Austria, after the war in 1867, then reorganized under like a dual monarchy that you may have heard of called the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or also called Austria-Hungary. It was because the Hungarians wanted more power, more rights, which they didn't have under the current Austrian Empire. And so basically they kind of split into this dual monarchy situation where Austria was one state, Hungary was another. They had separate parliaments and with also separate prime ministers, which is kind of weird. So you had Austrian parliament with a prime minister and Hungarian parliament with a prime minister. But they had the same military. Go figure. And then they had a dual monarchy where the Habsburg rulers, or Lorraine Habsburg was also called, which was at the time Emperor Franz Joseph. He was the Emperor of Austria, and he was also the King of Hungary. So he was a ruler that was in power a long time. I think he'd already been in power since 1848. And he'll be in power until World War I in 1916, reigning about, I think it's like 68 years. I forget how many. Yeah, I think 68 years he's in power. Long time. So that's what's happening with that. Now the other situation that happened too, that the North German Confederation didn't include the southern states in Germany, like they include Bavaria, the Rhineland, those areas that are kind of now in southern Germany. Those would be unified later due to the Franco-Prussian War. That was the other conflict that broke out 1870-71 between Prussia and France. Really, France was the only power on the left that could really stop the whole unification of Germany. And of course, as you know, the ruler of France at the time was Emperor Napoleon III, head of the Second French Empire. He was just itching for a fight with the Prussians. He didn't really like Germany and probably wanted revenge for, what happened at Waterloo a long time ago to his uncle. And so an excuse came for the war. What happened was there was a conflict over Spain. The ruler of Spain had been overthrown in 1868. Her name was Queen Isabel II. And they were trying to look for a new ruler to put in power. And there was a prince, I think his name was Prince Leopold, I think his name was, who was a relative of King William or Wilhelm I of Prussia. It was actually Hohenzollern. And this made the French mad because they didn't want to put a Hohenzollern ruler on the Spanish throne. So I think the Bourbons had ruled a long time there. And so there was talk of war between Prussia and France, but Leopold, I think at the last minute, Prince Leopold backed down and didn't really want the throne. That didn't end it though. And there was a meeting, I think, between King William I and one of the French ambassadors, and there was an incident where Bismarck took a dispatch from that and sent a telegram to the French saying basically that we might still put a guy on there anyway, even though they said they wouldn't. And so that became known as the Ems telegram, EMS, I think it was called Ems telegram. And of course the French took it as an insult, including Napoleon III. And so they decided that they had enough of the Germans, and they declared war on July 19th, 1870. That was a bad mistake, of course. He shouldn't have done that. Really, the French weren't ready for the Prussian German forces. They had already been planning this for a while, actually attack France. They didn't know this. Anyway, von Moltke and, of course, the Prussian armies and all that eventually invaded through what would be now Luxembourg and Belgium. Of course, Napoleon III forces, they tried to invade through the Rhineland at the same time. They were repulsed, and they were eventually retreated back to the northeastern part of France, near what is the city of Sedan. And what happened was in August of 1870, the Prussian forces then encircled Napoleon III's army in Sedan. That led to the so-called Siege of Sedan, Battle of Sedan. And eventually on September the 2nd, 1870, Napoleon III's army capitulated and they surrendered. And of course what ends up happening is real famous, as you know, that Bismarck, Moltke and his armies actually captured Napoleon III. And basically with his capture, the Second French Empire collapses in 1870. And after that, the French will declare a new republic. The French Third Republic forms afterwards, although it does struggle for the first like 6 months afterwards. I'll get to it later. I think we have a video later on the Franco-Prussian War we'll watch this week, but it's actually a case where they get laid siege to, and there's even a case they have the Paris Commune that occurs where these French revolutionaries and socialists actually take over the government for like a couple of months, which is kind of crazy. Now, after Napoleon III got captured, then the Prussian forces just invaded northern France. They laid siege to Paris, which went on for like 4 months. I think the siege lasted from September 19th to about September 19th, 1870, January 20th, 1871. So about 4 month siege, and got so bad that the French ran out of food to eat. And so if you know what happened, they started eating like any kind of animals they could find: rats, cats, dogs. They even started eating all the zoo animals. They were in the Paris Zoo, like elephants and anything else they could find. Pretty awful. They even made menus of food they were offering where it said, "Oh, no, I see the special for today is a dog. I'll eat a dog." Yuck. Anyway, but eventually the French were forced to capitulate. So January 28th, 1871, in what is the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, they kind of signed a preliminary treaty ending the war. That was called the Treaty of Versailles, signed on January 20th, 1871. Later there would be an official treaty, which is ratified, which is later in May 10th, 1871. It's called the Treaty of Frankfurt. So sometimes they call it the Treaty of Versailles-Frankfurt, which was kind of like two treaties. It was in the treaty, a bunch of stuff. First of all, the French had to pay the Prussians like 5 billion francs in war reparations in the war, and they had to give over territory. I think the Prussians seized control of Alsace-Lorraine, which is between France and Germany. So territory they kind of fight over years, France and Germany. They get that, and then the French were forced to recognize Otto von Bismarck as the Chancellor of the new German Empire that formed afterwards in 1871. They also had to recognize that King William I, or Wilhelm I, was now the Kaiser, or Emperor of Germany, the German Emperor. So they had to recognize that too. And this German Empire is called all kinds of names. They usually call it German Empire, or Germany, or something about Deutschland, which means fatherland. And so you'll call it the Hohenzollern Empire. The Second Reich, I think, is another name they kind of joked it was called, between the Holy Roman Empire, First Reich, and the Third Reich later with the Nazis. But it would last from like 1871 to 1918. These are the years for the so-called German Empire. It only had 3 rulers. Later we'll get to the most famous one, the third one, which is Emperor or Kaiser Wilhelm II, William II, who's a ruler, in World War I. And during that time, the German Empire tries to expand itself power-wise over Europe. And they kind of a major threat to Britain, France, and other powers. They'll later, be the ones that kind of influence why World War I breaks out. So that's pretty much, the Franco-Prussian War. I will have, like I said, a documentary on that this week. Franco-Prussian War is pretty much the war that creates a lot of animosity between the French and the Germans, and you see that in World War I and World War II later. That's why they end up fighting a lot in the future. Now the last thing I need to talk about today, of course, the outbreak of World War I. We'll be getting into like some 20th century topics coming up. That's one of the things I wanted to talk about, which was the causes of World War I. World War I, of course, broke out eventually at the beginning of the 20th century, 1914. Will last till 1918. And of course, as you know, it's one of the first of the 2 great world wars they had in the 20th century. You have World War I, also called the First World War. Then you got the Second World War, also called World War II. I'm wearing a shirt that says World War II, I know, but it's actually the National World War II Museum. That's what it is, if you're wondering. Now the old war, which is World War I, was called the Great War. That's what the old timers and veterans called it that fought in it. There wasn't a World War II yet, so nobody could call it World War One. And so that was the name that everybody dubbed it. And they thought it was the war to end all wars, like the greatest war ever fought, which it was. I think close to 10 million soldiers died in the war, which was quite a lot. I think it's the most ever that died in the war so far. All the civilian deaths and everything, and also the influenza epidemic, if you want to throw that in there. You've got 20, 30 million that died or more in World War One. And then when World War II happened, they had to change the name. And hey, now it's World War One, because we got World War II. God forbid there's a World War Three. Why did World War One break out? Well, it's got a lot of extensive causes of why it happened. A lot of it had to do with the rivalries of the great powers in Europe. That came to fruition in 1914. This had been building since the 1800s, whatever. Germany threw a monkey wrench in it, when they unified. That caused a lot of problems. It kind of, got rid of that balance of power that had happened before, going back to the Congress of Vienna. So, you got this other state there that's going to cause problems. And so over time, you see, we'll get to it later, they have these different alliance systems that form, and eventually what caused World War I to break out. It's kind of a chain reaction of these alliances. Let me go through some of the different, of course, long-term causes of why the World War I broke out. Of course, one of the first is imperialism. In the 19th and 20th century, there was a new type of imperialism that developed, which they called New Imperialism, is the term they used. And it was a type of imperialism where a lot of European powers were trying to create colonial possessions all over the world, mostly in Africa and Asia. And involved like a lot of European powers. The United States was involved even too. Even Japan got involved. You know about this. Japan was the first imperial power in modern times. Japan would try to take over the Pacific, parts of Asia, China. And in Africa, they had a scramble for Africa, where a lot of European powers first went in there to explore. Then they realized they could use it for natural resources, cheap labor. They began colonizing it. And within less than 100 years, Africa looked like this, where the European powers started taking it over, just kind of scrambling and conquering it. And like France was in mostly parts of West Africa, Algeria, Chad, so on. British were in Egypt, Sudan, parts of Ethiopia, South Africa, Kenya. You've got the Portuguese pretty much in that green area, West, East Africa, right there. You may have heard of the Belgium and the Congo as well. Of course, the Germans got involved. Germany was involved too. Parts of, can't see it, but those gray areas are areas where the Germans go in too. So this helps to intensify the rivalries between the different powers. And when World War I broke out, they were fighting there too, and that's part of what led to why it was a world war. Rise of nationalism, which we've talked a lot about in previous lectures. Yeah, nationalism played a major role. Probably they say the main cause of why World War I happened. Like we'll get to later, part of why they killed the Archduke, like a bunch of Slavic nationalists, was because they wanted like a Yugoslavian type Slavic state. And so that's the reason for it. Created a lot of intense nationalism, intense patriotism between different states. And so French wanting to kill Germans and vice versa, is something that, everybody wanted. There was a lot of pride in war at the time. People don't think about that now. People don't really want to go to war now like they used to, but it was seen as a very patriotic thing to fight for your country at the time. Militarism, what I mean by that is that there was a big arms race prior to World War I where both powers started to stockpile weapons and new technologies for war. World War I, was the war that pretty much created all the main technology in war you see later in other wars. So pretty much all the stuff they fight with in World War One. They're fighting in World War Two, Korea, and all that later on, like submarines and flamethrowers and machine guns, new kinds of bombs. Trench warfare, of course, had kind of already been there, going back to the American Civil War, but these forms of warfare were still around. Airplanes started to be used in air combat, and so on. So you had this intense buildup, and a lot of it was because of the Industrial Revolution, all the new technologies that came from that as a whole. Like Germany wanted to build a lot of dreadnoughts, which were these new battleships that were steel armored. The British were building a lot of dreadnoughts, and stuff like that. So Germany's trying to rival Britain, and so on, and that's pretty much, the reason for it. Then, of course, the big thing that really they think led to the, war was the competing alliance systems that formed by the late 19th century. A lot of it was because of the rivalry between Germany and France after the Franco-Prussian War. Those two hated each other. They helped form alliances that eventually will be the catalyst for the war. And like the French helped form the Triple Entente, was the first alliance that formed. Triple Alliance was one of them that formed. Triple Entente. And that was an alliance between France, Britain, and Russia originally. And then the Germans had their own version, which was called the Triple Alliance. It was called, so kind of similar name. And Germany was allied with Austro-Hungary and Italy. So it's kind of like you see this alliance system that forms prior to World War One. And Italy, of course, would switch, later. Italy would later back the Allied side because, later in the war they changed the names. Like the Triple Entente became the Allied powers or allies, and then later the Triple Alliance, I think, had more than three. So they started calling it the Central Powers because it's in the central part of Europe, mostly, where it was. Ottoman Empire would actually back the Germans and Austro-Hungarian side in the war. So you had all these different powers that were in the war. So basically a chain reaction later is going to cause the war, between the alliance systems to start World War One. They just needed spark, of course. And of course, later there's like a fifth cause they always talk about. That's the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he was supposed to be the next ruler, which probably would have ruled in 1916 because that's when Franz Joseph died. I know later he was the emperor still. And what happened was we'll get to it later, but he goes and visits what is Bosnia, which is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he's assassinated by these Slavic nationalists that want to create like a Slavic Yugoslavia type state. That's what killed him. They thought if they shot him that maybe that would happen, which it did later, I guess. But it was a spark that really ends up causing war to break out between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, because Serbia was where the Slavic nationalists were based in Belgrade. And that blew up into a bigger war within several days, actually really a month or so, but after, I think, Austria-Hungary gave Serbia like an ultimatum, within like a week the war broke out. But basically by June, July, of 1914, World War One becomes this big war that blows up. And it's going to be, like I said, the Great War, the war to end all wars, they thought, but eventually we'll see later it proves to be wrong because of World War II. So next week we'll get more into talking about like what happened in World War One. Pretty much all next week is just going to be about World War One, which I'll have in 2 podcast lectures over. I'll talk the first part, like the beginning of the war, up to probably 1914, 1915, and then I'll talk about the later part of the war in the week 1916 to 1918. Now we'll go into the what happens with the Russian Revolution, because that occurs about the same time when World War One happens. So we'll also go into like the beginning of the Soviet Union and all that. So that's it for this podcast for this week.